So we left off in the last video in the 1850s in Chicago, developing into a major metropolitan area. Not quite by that time, but it was definitely headed on that trajectory. And by the way, just as a side note, the guy who I really personally give credit for conceiving of Chicago as being a major city was our first mayor, William B. Ogden. I didn't talk about him in the previous videos, but he was the one who really had the vision. I think from my impression of reading about his life, he was the one who went out and made sure that we were going to get a railroad here. When he came in, it was just a bunch of like log cabins and stuff. Without him, I don't think that it would have headed in the direction that it eventually took us to, because there's a ton of waterfront on Lake Michigan. This particular spot wasn't necessarily more advantageous than any other spot north or south of here along the shores of Lake Michigan. Any place along Lake Michigan, you have access to that waterway. But this particular spot, our first mayor, I believe, foresaw it. So shout out to William B. Ogden. He has a street named after him in Chicago. For those of you who don't know, it's like a diagonal street runs into downtown. If you've seen me over at County Hospital when I'm walking around sometimes in videos, I've been over there in a couple of videos. That's on Ogden and Damon. So shout out to him. But having left off in the 1850s last video, I got to backtrack a little bit, because during the time period that I covered in like the last two videos, while all that was going on here, there was a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln who was growing up just a little bit to the east of here and eventually coming to Illinois to become one of our own U.S. House of Representatives here in the state of Illinois. And he actually passed the bar exam to become a lawyer the same year, 1837, that Chicago got incorporated as a city. Now, one thing I just want to talk about, because this is a big topic of debate I see in like historian circles. What were Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery? What were his real, true, honest views about black people and, what their fate should be in this country? So witnesses who saw him as a kid and people who knew him in his younger years before he got into politics said that he was firmly against slavery. Okay, so, from a personal level, that's pretty much not even a topic of debate. He was born in Kentucky. He was born in a very, he started from the bottom, okay, or at least what was considered the bottom for white people. I mean, obviously the bottom back then was a slave, but for white people, he started at the bottom. He was, in a life of hard labor early on, born in a little log cabin, and he had to grind every step of the way to make it. His eventual wife was somebody of social status, I should say. So he kind of married up in that sense, but he was considered like one of the quote poor whites. So he was born in Kentucky, which at the time was actually a slave state, but they weren't as loyal to the concept of, the slave states that the later states of the Confederacy were, because Kentucky was a border state, between the free North and the slavery holding South. So they actually ended up staying with the Union during the Civil War. They didn't go with the rest of the slave states to the south of them, and there were a lot of other border states that made the same decision. But he moved from Kentucky early on to Indiana, which was a free state. So growing up in a free state, that was his upbringing. He didn't really have any face-to-face confrontations with slavery until later in life when he took a trip to Louisiana. Growing up in Indiana, he just didn't see that. Okay, now, obviously later he became a politician here in Illinois as a member of the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party, I don't want to necessarily call it a precursor to the Republican Party, because there were a lot of issues that they were facing back then, slavery being one of them, that are no longer like in the political discussion today. So the parties back then, I don't think there was like an equivalent of the parties that we have today back then. The names were the same for the Democratic Party, but a lot of the positions were just totally different and having to do with issues that we wouldn't even have to, we're not dealing with anymore, like, the Mexican War and all this kind of stuff that's completely over. So, but he became a member of this Whig Party, and the Whig Party's base didn't really have a lot of very poor whites in it, at least not according to historians. Obviously, I wasn't alive back then, but their issues were a little bit more appealing to the higher classes than to the lowest classes. But they did they did have certain things in common with the eventual Republican Party. He eventually became Republican when that party started, okay? And there were other parties back then too. The Federalist Party by that time was defunct, but, there were some other parties. It was a lot more complex political landscape back then. And even the Democratic Party, which, they were the party that had the slaves, okay, in the South, they were split on the issue of slavery when it came to northern states, southern states. There were anti-slavery Democrats and there were pro-slavery Democrats. Not all Democrats were necessarily pro-slavery. Okay, now the eventual Republican Party, they were divided too, especially with regards to the war, like how to treat the Confederate prisoners. There were hardcore Republicans, who really wanted to take a tough line, and there were more moderate ones. So Lincoln had to play a lot of sides. He had a much tougher job than politicians have today. A much tougher job, man. And you see it eventually cost him his life. But he had to, he was really a chess master, man. I'm not really going to go into all the minute details of this. It would be a whole documentary, like 20 hours long. But he was really involved in some high-level maneuvering, okay? Playing one side, playing the other side. He was really playing chess, not checkers. But I digress. So he became a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois in 1846. Now, during this time, again, Chicago, it's growing. Okay, we got the grain coming in here. We got, the railroad, everything is getting set up. Chicago is becoming a major hub. So Chicago eventually became a holding camp during the Civil War of 10,000 Confederate soldiers. It was like a POW camp. Half of them ended up dying from the unsanitary conditions, which I mentioned in the last video. Okay, literally half of the Southern POWs that we had here died, and they were being held prisoner on the south side of Chicago. Now, the newspapers back then, they had to deal with issues, obviously, that we don't have to deal with today, one of them being slavery. There was a newspaper called The Liberator. This is one of the sides, by the way, that Lincoln had to deal with. So The Liberator was a newspaper put out by a guy named William Lloyd Garrison, who was a prominent abolitionist. And the abolitionist movement, what they wanted was total equal rights. William Lloyd Garrison, like John Brown, very religious guy, very devout Christian, based all his views on the Bible, did not believe that America could call itself a Christian nation and have slaves. So he wanted total abolition of total equal rights, voting rights, everything, and he wanted this to happen immediately. Okay, and he ran that newspaper called The Liberator. So Lincoln had to deal with the abolitionists. Okay, but once the Civil War started, he had to deal with the issue of these border states who remained loyal to the Union. Now, I see this going on, this discussion going on all the time. Like, was Lincoln really that concerned about freeing the slaves? Like, did he really care about black people? Because, as some of you may remember from history class, the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln put out in 1862, that did not free a single slave. It technically freed slaves in the southern states where, they were at war with the North now. How would they enforce that, though, when he didn't have any control over those areas? Those were rebel areas. So it didn't free slaves in the areas of the border states that were loyal to the Union that the Union did control. Now, why didn't he do that? Why didn't he free those slaves? He couldn't have freed those slaves politically back then because he was afraid that they would then go onto the side of the Confederacy and that then it would be no contest. The Union would lose. Okay? Now, you got to remember, if the Union loses, slavery is never going to end, right? The only chance of slavery ending anywhere is if the Union wins. So winning was the first and foremost priority. The abolitionists, they wanted him to just free all the slaves, but if he had listened to them, looking at this in hindsight, and those border states had all gone over to the Confederacy, who knows how long slavery would have gone on, because the South might have won. You know what I'm saying? So he said, we can't do this yet. We have to bide our time, because if we do this now, we have no chance of winning the war. So that's what he did, and then eventually the amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery completely. But William Lloyd Garrison, at this time, he actually burned a copy of the Constitution. He was saying that this was basically an agreement with hell, was how he put it. So there were very strong sentiments on both sides that Lincoln was having to, maneuver and play against. He also had to make it look like he wasn't just freeing the slaves so that he could, get an upper hand in the war. So he actually had to wait until the North scored a decisive victory at Antietam to be able to do that, even to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, so that it didn't look like they were losing. You know what I'm saying? Because to free the slaves, the North is they're getting killed, right? Like, because obviously they're getting killed. They're desperate. This is a desperate move. He couldn't make it look like a desperate move. That's why he had to wait till a victory happened in order to do it. For people saying that he should have freed the slaves earlier, these people have to remember that him freeing the slaves earlier would not have freed them. Like, him saying you're free wouldn't have made them free. Him issuing a document or a proclamation that all the slaves are free would not have actually practically freed them on the ground. That was the eventual goal. But here in Chicago, there was a lot of industrialization going on during this time. The number of factories tripled and the population of the city tripled. So this was a lot due to the war. You had a lot of the food that was being supplied to the Union Army coming out of Chicago, the stockyards, the Chicago stockyards in the mid-1860s, that came here, that was supplying, the Union troops. Chicago had an advantage. We had a strategic advantage during the Civil War in that, we were not as close to the front lines as some of the other cities that were in competition with us to be the main suppliers of the Union Army. And Chicago grew leaps and bounds during this time. Now, there was a problem, though, that Lincoln had to worry about, too. He's looking towards the future, right? Okay, now, the slaves, when they get free, when the South gets defeated and the slaves get free, what's going to happen? Are they just going to be hanging around in the same places where they were slaves? Probably not, right? They're going to be migrating north in vast numbers. Okay, what does that mean? It means that they're going to be competing for jobs in the north with the whites that were already there. Well, what does that mean? That means there's going to be a lot of conflict and a lot of resentment and bitterness. If any of those whites lose their jobs, the factory owners, all them, they might see an opportunity to be able to get the same work for a lower wage with the black workers. So they're going to be firing the white workers en masse. That's going to create even more, bitterness and resentment amongst the whites, which is going to create even more conflict. So all this stuff is on the horizon back then. What do we do? Okay, so Lincoln had to take this stuff into consideration. Some of you might have heard that Lincoln, actually, his plan was to basically kick black people out of the country. Although he wanted, hopefully, to do it with their, cooperation, but he wanted to send them to someplace like in the Caribbean or to Africa, to Liberia. That was his plan. He did not think, it wasn't that he wanted, he did not think that it was realistic for black people to stay here and to be able to live peacefully alongside whites after what had just happened in the past. He didn't think that this was going to work. He said, they've just been slaves all these years. To think that we're just going to, forget about all this and just make up and, get along from now on and live side by side together is just not realistic. He was foreseeing continual conflict in the future if black people stayed here. So he was hatching a plan to basically send black people away from the United States. Okay. And the abolitionists were against this. They said, no, black people, they should get the same rights here. Lincoln didn't believe at first that black people should get the right to vote. Later, he changed that to a little bit. He said black soldiers that served in the Union Army should get the right to vote, but not all black folks. He did not believe in total equality socially for black people. He believed that they had a right to freedom, obviously, and a right to a working wage. But as far as all the social rights of whites, he didn't believe that they should get all of that. When he was debating Stephen Douglas, Douglas brought this up in the debate. He was saying that, he accused Lincoln of being somebody who wanted to give black people total equal rights, and Lincoln denied it. Okay, he said, they should have the right to work and all that kind of thing. And this is over the course of his political career. I'm saying he was making this point that they should get that, but not everything. Yeah, Lincoln is a very controversial character, man, and a very complex character. And it's hard to get to the bottom of his motivations, honestly. And I can't even really say what they are because, like I said, he had so many different people to please that you can't necessarily say that it was him that wanted this or didn't want it. There was conflict going on in Chicago, even during this time, with black people who were coming to the North or who were already here at this point. And there was not a large number, like the Great Migration had not yet happened. but there were some here, and the whites here were already getting into it with them over this issue of basically labor. Now, at this particular time, there were four major ethnic groups in Chicago. Okay, there was actually like dozens of ethnic groups total, but the four biggest, you had the Germans were probably the biggest at this time. You had the Irish, the Polish, and the Swedes. Okay, the Italians were starting to come around this time, but they weren't one of the major players yet. The group that ended up gaining the most political power, despite not having as much of a population as the Germans, were the Irish. Okay, and anybody who's from Chicago knows, like, they've been the most powerful ethnic group politically for the longest time. Now, the reason for this, one was that unlike a lot of these other ethnic groups, the Germans, the Polish, and the Swedes, the Irish spoke English, right? So, you know, they weren't speaking different languages in their ethnic communities, and English was their native language. That was an advantage for them. The other one was that they only had one ethnic beef, and that was with the British. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or, you know, what they call them here in the United States, the Irish and them didn't get along. They didn't get along with, like, basically Anglo-Saxons, you know, people of British descent. And that's back there they had that problem, and over here they had that problem. But that was their only beef. Okay, they didn't have beef with the Germans or any of the other groups. All the other European groups that were here had beef with multiple other European groups. Polish, Lithuanians, Germans, I mean, all these groups, like, a lot of them, they had multiple other ethnic groups that would not vote for them simply because of their ethnicity. So the Irish, you know, they could go without the Anglo-Saxon vote. They didn't have to worry about that. They were the ones that were getting everybody else's votes, and they amassed the vast majority of political power. So the white workers here were having conflicts with the black prospective workers. It's always been about the jobs here. You know what I'm saying? They've always been afraid that, like, the blacks were going to take their jobs, which did happen in some cases, and they were willing to do anything, including physically keep them out of, you know, the factories or any place else where they were trying to work. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, man. Abraham Lincoln, like I said, he had a lot of controversial opinions. Trying to send black people away was one of the biggest ones. But a lot of the predictions that he made about some of the eventual conflicts, at least in the area of Chicago and in the industrial North, you know, where the Industrial Revolution was really going on, which faced this influx of black workers from the South, a lot of, you know, the conflicts that he was foreseeing in the future eventually did come true. But, you know, history sometimes is not just, it's not cut and dry. Like, you can look back and there's no way to know what would have happened had he done something different. In the 1870s, after this, and after the assassination of Lincoln, there was really big changes in store for the city, because we were going to have the Great Chicago Fire, which was going to cause the city to have to be completely rebuilt. That is coming in the next episode, about Abraham Lincoln's accomplishments. Like, you know, did he do things the right way? Should he have done things differently? Should he have freed the slaves immediately, or sent out a document freeing the slaves immediately? Like I said, it's doubtful that would have actually happened materially on the ground. But let me know, you know, what you guys think he should have done. You know, if you had been in his position, what would you have done? It's your boy Winnie City Report. I'm out.